Imagine finding yourself in a quiet, serene location, far from the chaos of everyday life. A cozy home nestled near the beach or deep within the woods, offering the perfect escape. For many, renting out a vacation property like this on Airbnb is not just a source of income, it's a way to share a piece of tranquility with others. But what happens when that sanctuary, that peaceful retreat, becomes the stage for something sinister? When trust is broken, and the unexpected turns your safe haven into a nightmare? This story begins with someone just like you or me, an ordinary person renting out their cherished property to strangers, trusting the process that has become so common in today's world. The idea is simple: provide a home for travelers, earn a little extra cash, and maybe even meet some interesting people along the way. Yet, beneath the surface of this seemingly harmless arrangement lies the potential for things to go horribly wrong. At first, everything seemed normal. The property was listed, the inquiries came in, and a renter was confirmed. Communication with the guest was polite and straightforward. They were a couple looking for a peaceful getaway, and the host felt confident this would be another smooth transaction. But as the keys were handed over and the guests settled in, subtle cracks began to appear in the facade of normalcy. This wasn't just about a rental, it was about trust, vulnerability, and the risks that come with opening your doors to strangers. The story that unfolds is a chilling reminder of how quickly the familiar can turn foreign, how the ordinary can spiral into the extraordinary, and how even the smallest decision can lead to unforeseen consequences. It's not just a tale of a bad guest or an uncomfortable situation, it's a deep dive into the unsettling unknown. The peaceful escape of the South Carolina house, a sanctuary by the beach, had always been a place of comfort and joy for its owner. Nestled in a picturesque setting, it was the perfect getaway spot, where the gentle sound of waves and the scent of salt air could wash away the worries of the world. Renting it out to travelers was a simple arrangement, one that brought life to the home even when the owner was away. It was supposed to be safe, easy, and straightforward. But this time, something felt different. When the owner arrived late at night after a grueling 16-hour drive, the house seemed undisturbed. It was quiet, as it should be. Exhausted from the journey, there was no thought to checking every corner, no reason to suspect anything was amiss. The master bedroom, always kept locked and secure, was a haven. That first night, the bed offered a much-needed refuge, and sleep came quickly. But peace was fleeting. In the middle of the night, an unsettling awareness crept in, a subtle, inexplicable feeling that something wasn't quite right. The stillness of the house wasn't calming, it was oppressive. Waking to the dim glow of a bedside lamp, the owner decided to explore, looking for the source of the unease. Everything appeared untouched. The house was as pristine as it had been when it was left for the renters. There was no sign of chaos, no disruption, nothing to suggest anything unusual. And yet, something lingered. A nagging sense of being watched, of not being alone. The night stretched on, its silence growing louder with every passing moment. The owner's pulse quickened as they checked rooms and closets, their mind battling between rationality and instinct. Every corner of the house was empty, but the feeling remained, stronger now, more insistent. Then, a subtle noise, a quiet, deliberate click of a door closing. The master bedroom, locked tightly, was no longer just a private retreat. It was the epicenter of something far darker than the owner had ever imagined. The unsettling click of the master bedroom door was like a jolt to the heart, a sound that shattered the fragile sense of security the house had offered. The owner froze, staring at the closed door, dread pooling in their chest. The light from inside the room spilled faintly through the bottom crack, casting long, eerie shadows on the floor. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was deliberate. Summoning courage, the owner called out, their voice trembling in the oppressive silence. "Ramon? Are you still in here?" The name echoed hollowly through the house, but no answer came. The only response was the oppressive quiet, now charged with an electric tension. The decision to investigate felt both brave and reckless, but there was no other choice. On all fours, the owner peered under the door, their breath hitching as their eyes adjusted to the dim light. And then they saw them, 2 feet, standing unnervingly still, mere inches away from the door. Panic surged like a tidal wave. Whoever was inside wasn't moving, wasn't making any effort to explain or reassure. It was an unspoken standoff, the kind that sent adrenaline coursing through the veins. Fighting the urge to bolt, the owner made a calculated decision to arm themselves. The knife holder in the kitchen held the promise of protection, but when they reached it, the largest knife was missing. Now the stakes were clear. This wasn't just an unwelcome guest, it was something far more sinister. Clutching at the only option left, the owner bolted out of the house and dialed 911, their words tumbling out in frantic urgency. As the minutes dragged on and the police arrived, the nightmare intensified. The person inside wasn't a stranger, they were Ramon. But his demeanor was calm, his excuses unnervingly plausible. He claimed he needed just one more night, speaking with a disarming innocence that clashed sharply with the terror he'd caused. The missing knife had mysteriously reappeared, resting back in its holder, as if mocking the owner's fear. The police, unconvinced of any immediate danger, let him go with a warning. Standing alone in the aftermath, the owner felt more vulnerable than ever. Ramon might have been gone, but the threat he embodied lingered, like a shadow cast over the sanctuary they once called their own. The drive to the remote cabin was supposed to be a journey toward peace, a chance to escape the suffocating stress of life and find solace in the stillness of nature. The scenic countryside and fiery autumn foliage painted a picture of tranquility, but beneath the surface, an unease lingered, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. The cabin itself was quaint, perched on a quiet hill surrounded by dense woods. It was exactly as described, a perfect retreat from the noise of the world. The air was crisp and fresh, and for a moment, stepping out of the car, there was a glimmer of hope that this weekend might bring the calm that had been so desperately needed. But even in the daylight, signs of something strange began to emerge. On the drive back from exploring the nearby trails, two figures appeared on the gravel road. They walked slowly, their faces obscured, but as the car passed, they stopped. They didn't wave, didn't smile. Their heads turned in unison to watch the car disappear, their gaze lingering far too long. It was a small detail, easy to dismiss, but it stuck, a quiet alarm bell ringing in the back of the mind. Returning to the cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon, the serenity of the location morphed into something far more unsettling. The isolation that had seemed so appealing now felt oppressive. The cabin stood alone in the darkness, its warm glow a fragile defense against the encroaching night. And then it happened. Stepping outside to retrieve a bag, movement at the edge of the property caught the eye. Two figures darted into the woods, their shadows blending with the trees. The instinctive explanation was simple, curious locals or wandering hikers, but the memory of their silent stares on the road earlier made it harder to shrug off. Even after locking the doors and settling back into the cozy space, the sense of being watched lingered. It clung to the edges of the night, creeping into every quiet moment. The darkness outside the windows felt alive, the kind of blackness that swallows light whole. The owner's reassurances, delivered casually via text, did little to alleviate the growing paranoia. Teens in the area, they had said. But no amount of reasoning could quiet the gnawing thought, this wasn't normal. Something about this place wasn't right. As the hours passed, the cabin grew colder and quieter, the walls feeling less like a haven and more like a fragile barrier against an unseen threat. The promise of peace dissolved entirely, leaving only a thick, suffocating tension. This was no longer a retreat, it was the prelude to a nightmare. The night descended fully, wrapping the isolated cabin in an impenetrable darkness. Inside, the dim glow of a small fire in the hearth provided a fleeting sense of comfort. The flickering light danced across the walls, but the shadows it cast seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways, feeding the unease that had been simmering since the day's strange encounters. Dinner was quick and unremarkable, more of a distraction than a meal. Each bite was mechanical, the mind too preoccupied with the unsettling thoughts swirling just beneath the surface. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. Every creak of the old cabin, every whisper of wind against the windows, felt amplified, like the house itself was alive and breathing. Then, as if on cue, the lights suddenly went out. The darkness swallowed everything, leaving only the faint glow of the fire. The suddenness of it sent a jolt through the air. Fumbling for the phone, the screen's cold light was a momentary relief. A message from the cabin owner came quickly in response to the report of the outage, suggesting the main breaker near the back of the house should be checked. But stepping outside into the pitch-black night wasn't an option. The memory of the two figures slipping into the woods earlier lingered too strongly. The thought of venturing into the shadows where they might still be lurking sent a shiver down the spine. No, staying inside was the only option, even if it meant sitting in the dark. Then came the sound. It started faint, like a soft creak, but quickly grew unmistakable, a deliberate footstep on the wooden floor. The source of the noise was hidden in the farthest, darkest corner of the room, near the bathroom door. The dim firelight barely illuminated the space, but enough to reveal a tall, looming figure standing motionless in the doorway. The air felt electric with fear, the kind that paralyzes every muscle and drowns out rational thought. A voice emerged from the darkness, soft yet chilling, instructing in a low, steady tone to remain calm and hand over everything. The figure didn't move, but the menace in its presence was suffocating. Shaking, words stumbled out, an explanation of what little there was to take. The figure gave no indication of emotion, no sign of empathy or anger, only a cold, calculated control. It demanded money, and trembling hands complied, emptying the wallet onto the table. Then came the order to move to the kitchen and wait. It was a command impossible to disobey. The next sound was the door opening and closing, marking the intruder's departure. But the air in the cabin remained heavy, thick with the echoes of what had just happened. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. It was over, but the question remained, was it truly safe? The following day arrived, but the sense of unease lingered like a fog over every thought. Sunlight streamed through the windows, yet it brought little comfort. The events of the previous night replayed in fragmented bursts, every sound, every shadow, and that haunting voice demanding submission. It felt unreal, like a waking nightmare that refused to dissipate with the dawn. Determined not to let fear paralyze them, a decision was made to leave the cabin during the day for a hike. The surrounding woods were supposed to be an escape, a sanctuary of tranquility, but every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping twig, felt like a warning. The beauty of the wilderness seemed tainted, as if the trees themselves harbored secrets too dark to reveal. Returning to the cabin in the late afternoon, the house stood as it had been left, yet it felt different. The air inside was heavier, the silence deeper, almost as if the walls were holding their breath. That evening, after a makeshift dinner, an unsettling thought crossed the mind. Was the intruder from the night before truly gone? The doors were checked and rechecked, every window inspected, but the nagging doubt refused to be silenced. As night fell, the oppressive darkness returned, swallowing the cabin and its surroundings whole. The quiet was deafening, amplifying every subtle noise, a distant owl's call, the wind brushing against the trees, and then, footsteps. This time they were outside, circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate, each step a reminder that the safety of the day had vanished with the sun. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then came a loud thud, as if someone had thrown themselves against the front door. Heart pounding, the mind raced through possibilities. Was it the same intruder? Were there more of them? Or was it something else entirely? Grabbing the closest makeshift weapon, a heavy lamp, the body froze, waiting for the next move. The thud didn't repeat, but a faint scratching sound began at the back of the cabin. Whatever it was testing the limits, looking for a way inside. Fear turned into a desperate plan. A phone call to the police was made, the trembling voice on the other end explaining the situation in hurried fragments. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the scratching persisted, moving from one side of the cabin to another, always just out of sight. When the police finally arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness like a lifeline, the sounds ceased. An exhaustive search of the area turned up nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, no indication of who or what had been outside. The officers reassured that it was likely an animal, but the pit in the stomach told a different story. Whatever had been outside wasn't just passing by. It was watching, waiting, and it knew they were there. The following night brought an even deeper sense of dread, a suffocating heaviness that seemed to grip the air inside the cabin. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the wind felt amplified, as if the house itself were alive, reacting to an unseen presence. The decision to stay another night wasn't made out of bravery but necessity. Leaving in the pitch-black darkness of the isolated woods felt just as dangerous as staying. As the hours stretched on, the group tried to distract themselves, playing card games and sharing stories, though every laugh felt hollow. The atmosphere was thick with unease, every shadow on the wall casting suspicion. The windows were closed, the doors double-locked, but the sense of exposure remained. They were in a fragile bubble, surrounded by an encroaching darkness that felt alive. Then came the sound, a distinct, rhythmic tapping against one of the windows. Everyone froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. The tapping continued, deliberate and slow, as if toying with them. Gathering courage, one of them approached the window, heart pounding, and peeked through the curtains. Nothing. The yard outside was empty, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. They convinced themselves it must have been a branch or some trick of the wind, but just as they began to relax, the tapping resumed, this time on a different window, further away. It was moving. Someone or something was circling the cabin, testing their resolve. The group huddled together in the living room, whispering about what to do next. The tapping continued, moving from window to window, growing louder, more insistent. Then, it stopped altogether. The silence was worse. It stretched on endlessly, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing. Without warning, a loud bang erupted from the back door, as if something heavy had slammed against it. The group jumped to their feet, panic setting in. They grabbed anything that could serve as a weapon, a fireplace poker, a kitchen knife, a heavy flashlight. Another bang followed, then another, each one shaking the door in its frame. Someone dialed 911 again, their voice trembling as they described the situation. The dispatcher assured them help was on the way, but in the middle of nowhere, how long would that take? The group braced themselves, hearts racing, waiting for the door to give way. But it didn't. The banging stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Minutes felt like hours as they stood there, every sense heightened, straining to detect any sign of movement. When the sound of distant sirens finally broke the silence, it was like a lifeline had been thrown to them. The police arrived and swept the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But once again, they found nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no signs of forced entry. It was as if whatever had been outside had simply vanished. The officers reassured them that they were safe now, but their words rang hollow. Whatever had been out there wasn't gone, it was watching, waiting, and they knew it would be back. The next morning was eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The group, sleep-deprived and on edge, gathered in the living room to discuss their options. Sunlight streamed through the windows, momentarily easing the tension, but the memories of the previous night lingered like a dark cloud over their heads. Despite the daylight, unease had settled deeply into their bones. Alexis suggested leaving immediately, but Rob argued they had come too far to let fear ruin the trip. The group debated back and forth, the air thick with anxiety. Eventually, they decided to stay but agreed to stick together and keep watch at all times. The plan was to spend the day hiking nearby trails, hoping the fresh air and activity would clear their minds and shake off the paranoia. As they ventured into the woods, the towering trees and vibrant fall colors seemed to mock their fear. The serene beauty of the landscape clashed with the lingering dread, creating an unsettling dissonance. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves drew nervous glances, but they pushed on, trying to focus on the trail ahead. It wasn't long before the group stumbled upon something that stopped them in their tracks, a small, decrepit shed hidden deep in the woods. It hadn't been on any map or mentioned in the Airbnb listing, and its sudden appearance felt wrong, out of place. The shed was old, its wooden planks weathered and warped, the door slightly ajar. Alexis, always the curious one, suggested they take a look inside. The others hesitated, but curiosity outweighed their fear. They approached cautiously, their footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. Pushing the door open revealed a room that smelled of damp earth and decay. Inside were old, rusted tools, broken furniture, and what appeared to be a makeshift bed made of dirty blankets and a flattened mattress. On one of the walls was something even more chilling, photos pinned to the wood, their edges yellowed and curling. The images were grainy and hard to make out, but they were of people, most of them taken outside in what looked like the very woods they were standing in. One of the photos was of the cabin they were staying in, captured from a distance through the trees. A sense of violation washed over them, their private getaway now tainted by the realization that someone had been watching them. Rob grabbed one of the photos, and as he held it closer, they all noticed the timestamp in the corner. It was from just 2 days ago. Panic set in. They backed out of the shed, scanning the woods around them for any sign of movement, any hint that someone was nearby. But the forest was silent, unnaturally so. It felt as though they were being watched, even if they couldn't see who, or what, was watching. The group hurried back to the cabin, their carefree hike now a desperate retreat. Once inside, they locked every door and window, drawing the curtains tightly shut. They debated whether to pack up and leave, but fear of driving through the dark, isolated roads at night made them hesitate. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin grew darker, and the oppressive sense of dread returned. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, they knew they weren't alone. The photos in the shed were proof. Someone had been there, and the question that haunted them now was simple: were they still out there, waiting for the cover of darkness to make their move? Night descended like a heavy blanket, wrapping the cabin in suffocating darkness. Inside, the group huddled together in the living room, the once cozy space now a fortress against the unknown. The fire flickered weakly in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Every creak of the cabin seemed amplified, each one sending a jolt of adrenaline through their veins. Kelly suggested calling the local authorities again, but Rob reminded her of the officer's dismissive attitude the night before. "They'll just say it's nothing again," he muttered, frustration and fear lacing his voice. Despite the hopelessness of the idea, they decided to try. Alexis dialed the local station, her hands trembling as she explained the shed, the photos, and the feeling of being watched. The dispatcher promised to send someone to check on them, but her tone carried the same skepticism they had encountered before. The group tried to keep their minds occupied, playing cards and telling stories, but it was clear their focus was elsewhere. Every so often, one of them would glance at the windows or strain their ears at an unfamiliar sound. Hours crept by, the tension in the air so thick it was hard to breathe. Then it happened. A loud, deliberate knock echoed through the cabin. It wasn't at the front door but at the back, where the dense woods crept dangerously close. The sound was jarring, slicing through the silence and sending the group into a panic. Alexis grabbed a flashlight, her hands trembling as she pointed it toward the door. The light shook as it illuminated the wooden frame, but nothing else. Rob, armed with a fire poker, motioned for everyone to stay quiet. He inched toward the door, his breath audible in the otherwise still cabin. The knock came again, harder this time, and he froze. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't going away. "Who's there?" Rob shouted, his voice wavering despite his attempt to sound authoritative. No response came, just the sound of the wind brushing through the trees. The group stared at the door, their imaginations running wild with possibilities. Alexis whispered that they should turn off the lights and make it seem like no one was home, but Kelly argued it was too late for that. Whoever was out there knew they were inside. The knock turned into pounding, the doorframe shaking with each heavy hit. The group scrambled, Rob yelling for everyone to grab something to defend themselves. Kelly had a heavy candlestick, Alexis a kitchen knife, and the rest clung to whatever they could find. They formed a loose circle in the living room, their eyes darting between the door and the windows. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the pounding stopped. Silence filled the cabin once more, but it was far from comforting. The group stayed frozen, their ears straining for any sound, any indication of movement outside. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, And just as they began to think it was over, a window shattered. Glass sprayed across the living room as the firelight caught a figure darting past the jagged frame. Chaos erupted as Rob lunged toward the window, swinging the fire poker wildly. The rest of the group screamed, backing into the far corner of the room. Alexis fumbled for her phone, desperate to call the police again. Outside, the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path surrounded the cabin. It wasn't just one set of footsteps, it was multiple, circling them like predators stalking prey. Shadows moved past the windows, too fast to focus on but undeniably there. The group realized they were outnumbered. This wasn't a random encounter or a lone drifter, it was deliberate. Whoever was outside had planned this, and they were executing it with terrifying precision. Trapped and isolated, the group clung to each other, their only hope being that the police would arrive before it was too late. The stillness of the night was shattered as a loud bang echoed through the cabin. The front door rattled on its hinges, the force of the impact reverberating through the walls. Everyone froze, their breath caught in their throats. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, trembling under the weight of the intruders' intentions. Alexis whispered, "We need to hide," her voice barely audible but full of urgency. Rob motioned for them to move, his fire poker gripped tightly in his hands. They scrambled to their feet, the weight of panic making their movements clumsy and loud. The group scattered, some ducked into the small bathroom, others crammed into the narrow pantry off the kitchen. Kelly and Alexis ended up in the pantry together, pressed against the cold shelves as they tried to stifle their breathing. The faint scent of stale spices and canned goods did little to mask the metallic tang of fear in the air. Kelly held her phone tightly, its screen dimmed to avoid detection, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Alexis clutched a kitchen knife, her knuckles white with tension. From their hiding spots, they could hear the door groan as it was forced open. Heavy footsteps thudded against the floor, moving methodically through the cabin. Whoever was there wasn't in a hurry. They were taking their time, savoring the hunt. The intruders spoke in low tones, their words muffled but sinister. They seemed to be searching for something, or someone. Every noise, every footstep, sent shivers down Kelly's spine. She tried to meet Alexis's gaze, but Alexis's eyes were locked on the crack between the pantry doors, watching the dim light outside flicker as shadows passed. In the living room, Rob crouched behind the couch, holding his breath as the footsteps drew closer. He gripped the fire poker, silently rehearsing how he might defend himself if it came to that. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound almost deafening in the silence. The intruders moved deeper into the house, their boots creaking on the wooden floors. One of them opened a cabinet in the kitchen, slamming it shut when it revealed nothing. Another jiggled the handle of the bathroom door, testing its lock. Stephanie, hidden inside the bathroom, covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming silently down her face. Then, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "We know you're here," one of the intruders called out, his tone almost playful. "There's no use hiding." The group's collective terror deepened. They were no longer just victims of a break-in, they were being hunted. Whoever these people were, they weren't just after valuables. They wanted more. In the pantry, Kelly's phone buzzed faintly in her hand. She had texted her location to 911 earlier, but the response came too late. The buzzing wasn't loud, but it was enough. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and Kelly felt her stomach drop. The intruders had heard it. The footsteps grew louder, heading toward the kitchen. Alexis tightened her grip on the knife, her chest heaving as she struggled to stay silent. Kelly mouthed, "Don't move." But the footsteps stopped right outside the pantry. The door handle turned slowly, the metal creaking as if to mock their fear. Kelly's mind raced. Was this it? Would they be found? She braced herself, every muscle in her body tensing. Suddenly, the wail of police sirens broke through the silence, their piercing sound carrying over the trees. The intruders cursed under their breath, their heavy boots retreating toward the front door. The sound of their hurried escape echoed through the cabin as the group remained frozen, unsure if it was truly over. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually, The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the cabin windows. The group emerged from their hiding spots, their bodies shaking with adrenaline and relief. They ran outside to meet the officers, their words tumbling over each other as they explained what had happened. The police searched the area, but the intruders were gone. They found tracks in the mud and signs of forced entry, but no tangible clues as to who these people were or why they had targeted the cabin. The officers assured the group they would patrol the area and urged them to leave the cabin immediately. As they packed their belongings, the group couldn't shake the lingering fear. What had started as a peaceful getaway had turned into a nightmare, one that would haunt them long after they left the woods. The cabin, once a symbol of tranquility, now stood as a grim reminder of the night they barely escaped. As the group sped away from the cabin, the oppressive silence of the woods gave way to the hum of the car engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. Nobody spoke. The weight of what they had just experienced pressed heavily on their chests. Alexis sat in the passenger seat, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. Rob gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he focused on putting as much distance as possible between them and the cabin. In the back seat, Kelly and Stephanie clung to each other. Stephanie's quiet sobs filled the car, her tears streaming as she replayed the moment the intruders had tried to force open the bathroom door. Kelly stared out the window, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Who were those people? Why had they chosen their cabin? And most chillingly, how long had they been watching? The car's headlights illuminated the dense trees lining the road, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move and writhe like phantoms. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified, a cruel reminder of the danger they had narrowly escaped. None of them could shake the feeling that they were still being watched, that the intruders might somehow follow them. Finally, they reached the nearest town, a small, sleepy place with a single gas station and a diner. Rob pulled into the gas station parking lot, and the group piled out of the car. The fluorescent lights of the station felt almost blinding after the darkness of the woods. It was a small reprieve, a fragile sense of safety. They went inside, where the clerk behind the counter looked up with mild curiosity. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone casual. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, nobody knew how to respond. Rob finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "You could say that." The clerk didn't press further, sensing the unease radiating from the group. Instead, he returned to his crossword puzzle, leaving them to gather their thoughts. Alexis leaned against the counter, her hands trembling as she clutched a bottle of water. Kelly found herself pacing the small store, her mind replaying the events of the night in a relentless loop. "Do we call someone?" Stephanie finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We already called the police," Rob said, his tone sharper than he intended. He softened his voice when he added, "They're not going to do much more. They didn't even find those guys. They know where we were staying," Alexis said, her voice shaking. What if they come after us?" That thought sent a fresh wave of panic through the group. The idea of being hunted didn't seem far-fetched after what they'd experienced. They decided, right there in the gas station, that they wouldn't go back to the cabin. Their belongings that had been left behind, food, books, even Rob's favorite jacket, no longer mattered. Staying safe was their only priority. After a brief, hushed discussion, they decided to book a motel room for the night in town. None of them could bear the thought of driving all the way home in their current state. Alexis pulled out her phone to search for nearby motels while the others waited, the tension between them palpable. When they finally checked into the small, shabby motel, the group locked the door behind them and barricaded it with a chair. The room was cramped, with faded wallpaper and a single, flickering lamp, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the cabin. Nobody cared about comfort. They just wanted to feel safe. They stayed awake for hours, talking in hushed voices about what had happened. Theories ranged from a random break-in to something far more sinister. Kelly brought up the possibility that the cabin's owner might have been involved, her voice trembling as she recounted the owner's dismissive response to her earlier message. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion finally began to take over. One by one, they drifted into uneasy sleep, their dreams haunted by shadowy figures and the sound of heavy footsteps. The events of the night had left an indelible mark on all of them, a scar that no amount of distance could erase. When morning came, they packed up and left the motel, each of them determined never to set foot in the woods again. The cabin, once a symbol of escape and relaxation, had turned into a nightmare they would carry with them forever. Even as they returned to their normal lives, the memories lingered, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. And though they tried to move on, a single, unspoken question haunted them all: what would have happened if they hadn't gotten out in time? As dawn broke over the small motel, the faint glow of the rising sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. The group sat silently in the cramped room, their bags packed, their faces etched with exhaustion. None of them had slept well. The events of the night before had carved deep grooves of fear into their minds, and the light of day did little to erase them. Rob was the first to break the silence. "We should go," he said, his voice hoarse. The others nodded in agreement, though the weight of their unspoken thoughts hung heavily in the air. They knew that leaving the motel didn't mean leaving behind what had happened. The memories, the fear, and the unanswered questions would follow them. They piled into the car, the silence between them now deafening. As they drove out of town, the woods seemed to loom on either side of the road, a dark and oppressive reminder of the night before. The once beautiful scenery now felt like the backdrop of a nightmare. Kelly stared out the window, her mind racing with fragments of the night, the heavy footsteps, the chilling green flash, the figure in the shadows. "Do you think we'll ever really know what that was?" she asked quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Alexis, sitting in the passenger seat, shook her head. "I don't think I want to know," she replied, her voice trembling. "Whatever it was, it's better left in those woods." Stephanie, still visibly shaken, turned to the group from the back seat. "Do you think we'll ever feel safe again?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered. As they reached the highway, the group fell into a somber silence. The long stretch of road ahead seemed to promise a return to normalcy, but they all knew it wouldn't be that simple. The woods, the cabin, the eerie crunch of footsteps, those things would stay with them, lingering in the corners of their minds. When they finally reached home, they parted ways with quiet goodbyes. There were no jokes, no reassurances, just the unspoken understanding that they had shared something terrible, something that would bind them together in a way none of them had wanted. For weeks afterward, they avoided talking about the trip. When friends asked about their getaway, they offered vague answers, brushing off the questions with forced smiles. But at night, when the world was quiet and the shadows grew long, the memories returned. Rob couldn't sleep without checking the locks on his doors 3 times. Kelly found herself avoiding wooded areas altogether. Stephanie started sleeping with a light on, unable to shake the image of the shadowy figure that had haunted her. And Alexis, though she tried to move on, would often wake in a cold sweat, her mind replaying the green flash and the sound of those relentless footsteps. Months later, they would learn that other guests at the same Airbnb had reported strange occurrences, noises in the night, missing belongings, sightings of shadowy figures near the shed. The property was eventually removed from the listing, but the mystery remained unsolved. As for the group, the experience left them changed. They had come face to face with something unexplainable, something terrifying. And though they had escaped with their lives, they knew that a part of them would always remain in those woods, haunted by the shadows they couldn't leave behind. In the end, they realized some mysteries were best left unsolved. And as they moved forward with their lives, they carried with them a deep understanding of how fragile safety truly was, and how quickly the ordinary could descend into the extraordinary. To anyone considering a stay in an isolated cabin, they would offer only this: sometimes, it's better not to look too closely into the darkness. Because you never know what might be looking back.